Hello and welcome to day 14 of our daily Bible reading plan. Today we're going to be looking at Genesis chapters 34 to 36 and Luke chapter 14. We have a strange story from Genesis about Dinah, and then we're going to be looking at Jesus' teaching on humility. So let's dive into Dinah. Dinah is one of Jacob's children. Now, Jacob has a whole bunch of sons. We don't hear much about the daughters. There had to have been a bunch of daughters born among all of the sons. And Dinah is one of the daughters who comes from Leah, the first wife of Jacob, but not the one that he loves the most. The core of this story is pretty horrible. There is a sexual assault on Dinah by Shechem. Now, Shechem is the name of the guy who does this, who then falls in love with her and wants to marry her. Shechem is also the name of an important city in Canaan, and we will hear about it later in the story of Joshua as well. So there are kind of two levels going on here. There is what specifically happens to Dinah, which is horrible, but there's also the relationship between Jacob and his family and the people of Canaan who are living in the city of Shechem. So after this horrific assault, Shechem falls in love with Dinah, asks for his father to go and negotiate with Jacob in order for Shechem to be able to marry Dinah. Now, a couple of Jacob's sons find out about this. They decide to take matters into their own hands. This is Simeon and Levi. And part of the negotiation, Jacob's like, well, everyone's got to be circumcised in Shechem if anything is going to happen, because this is the rule of Abraham's family now that Jacob is following. And so Shechem wants Dinah so badly, loves her so much, he and all the men of Shechem decide to get circumcised. Two of the brothers go in a couple days later while the men are still recovering and kill all the men. And then the other brothers come and loot the city, which involves also taking the wives and children for themselves. Now, this is a pretty horrific story, and it really goes beyond what most of our experiences are today. But I think the question for us to think about is, what do we value and honor today? What do we do? What types of revenge and retaliation do we pursue? What does a reputation mean to us today? Now, it's clear that Jacob thinks that the sons went too far in all of this, and we'll get to a little bit more on that in a moment. But I think we still have the tendency to sometimes go too far in our own ideas of revenge and retribution. And I think this is something that, while the circumstances might be different, the core issue of how do we react, and are we staying within the teachings of God and Jesus as we are making the decisions in our lives of how we live together in community. After this story, God calls Jacob to return to Bethel. Now, one of the things to remember here is that El is a name for God. So when you read Bethel, this means God's house. Israel, Elijah, Elisha. Whenever you see El in a Hebrew name, that is showing a connection to our God and our understanding of God. So God's name is El, one of the names of God. Jacob returns to Bethel. He is going to be worshiping. He tells everyone to get rid of their idols and to clean themselves up. So it is clear that some of the religious practices of the people around Jacob's family have been seeping into the practice of Jacob's family. Now, Jacob's new name after he wrestled with God was Israel, which meant God wrestler. In the process of going back to Bethel for this time of worship, and I would argue an opportunity for Jacob to remove his family from whatever chaos that they have caused with the city of Shechem, Rachel, his beloved wife, goes into labor for the final time, gives birth to the 12th son, who is named Benjamin, but in the process, she dies in labor, which brings great grief to Jacob. Now, there's this weird little line that Reuben, the firstborn son, sleeps with Bilhah, one of the concubines of Jacob, the one of the slaves or maid servants. Now, this is eventually going to cause some problems too, because this is not something that is done. This is a violation of cultural norms. And eventually this means that Reuben is going to lose his firstborn status because of this bad decision he makes. I think the biggest thing to take away from this whole process of the relationship with Shechem and the city of Shechem and the movement to a new place is that Jacob is looking to remain faithful to God. He removes his family from the temptations that they were experiencing where they were living, and Jacob reminds them all to turn their focus onto God and to stay faithful to the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. There's not to be any intermarrying, because when you intermarry, then you lose your identity and you start to assimilate the other religious practices. Now, the other thing to remember is that Simeon and Levi are the two brothers that really take the worst action in this entire story. Now, there's 12 tribes of Israel relating to the 12 sons of Jacob. But later on, after the Exodus story, when the tribes are returning to the promised land, the land is divided up and given to the tribes. And as you watch carefully when we get to that point, you will see that Levi and Simeon do not end up with any land. Simeon ends up being joined to one of the other tribes, and the tribe of Levi becomes the priestly tribe. They are spread throughout to offer the services of the religious services to the community, and they do not end up with any land. So there is a consequence for the choices that they've made here. As we look to chapter 14 in Luke, Jesus' main theme for this entire chapter is humility. He starts out having a meal with some of the religious leaders, the Pharisees, and they ask him questions about the Sabbath, like, can you heal people on the Sabbath? Because they're concerned that Jesus isn't following the rules, the law, very precisely. And Jesus heals someone right in front of them and says, I think God cares more about the value of the person rather than the adherence to the law. And this really becomes an ongoing argument between Jesus and the Pharisees. Jesus goes on to explain more about wedding feasts and who do you invite to dinner. And he talks about where do you sit, and don't sit at the place of honor. Take a lesser place. And then, if you are honored by the host, they will move you up. But you don't want to be humiliated by sitting in the wrong place and then be moved down. And you don't want to just invite friends and families who can invite you back and repay you for your hospitality. So Jesus wants people to go out and invite the outcasts, the marginalized, the people that you're not going to get anything from. In Roman culture at that time, the culture of gratitude was a little different from what we understand as the culture of gratitude today. For them, it wasn't just giving thanks for something that someone had given you, but it was also physical gifts and tips and perhaps even bribes. It was partly how you set yourself up in social status in Roman society. Sometimes we call this brown nosing. You're giving things to the people above you to influence them, to impress them, to make yourself look good. And hopefully they in some way might be able to help you move up the ladder of Roman society to a new status point. So there are no benefits for giving anything to people who are lesser than you. So Jesus is really radical here. Jesus is really turning social constructs on their head. He's like, what is most important is reaching out to the people who are marginalized and outcast. I think this is a big lesson for especially our churches today, as well as ourselves individually. But as a church, how often do our congregations try to get us to focus on taking care of ourselves and finding other people like ourselves? Jesus wants us to invite outcasts and marginalized people, and we're focused mostly on the people in the wedding feast who are too busy to come. Oh, I've got stuff going on with my kids. I'm going to my cabin this weekend. I have a lot of things going on. Are we making spending time with Jesus the primary thing in our lives? And are we trying to reach out to people who have a lot of excuses for why they don't have time for Jesus and church in their life? And I think this is something that's going to take a lot more work on our part, but I think this is where Jesus is calling us to go. Stop spending time on the people who don't have time for Jesus and church. Instead, focus on the people who are lost and lonely. So the final thing that he talks about is that there's a cost to following Jesus. We are to pick up a cross and follow. We are to learn the ways of Jesus and even put Jesus ahead of our own family. There is a cost to following Jesus, and Jesus expects us to invest in our relationship with God. We'll see you next time.